Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today and attending this very exciting panel entitled Why Sport Needs to Decolonize. It's the second discussion we've had as part of the Sport Diversity and Race Project that I'm heading up with Dr. Cheri Bradish, exploring the tensions and challenges of diversity, race, and inclusion in sport and the sport industry. My name is Dr. Richard Norman. Just to begin, this event wouldn't be possible without the support of the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University in partnership with MLSE Foundation, MLSE LaunchPad, and Ryerson's Office of the Vice President of Equity and Community Inclusion. We were hoping that we could have a welcome address, but I think that Dr. Denise O'Neill Green is running a little bit late. So I'm going to pass it over to Savannah Webb from MLSE Launchpad to give us a land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Richard. Ryerson's ongoing commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion and the truth and reconciliation process for Indigenous people in Canada include a land acknowledgement as a signal of recognition and action to ensure historical inequalities that address and rectify. Toronto is in a dish with a spoon territory. The dish with one spoon territory treaty is between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them and share the territory to protect the land. Subsequently, the Indigenous nations and people, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited to the treaty in spirit of peace, friendship, and respect from the Aboriginal Education Council. And a special thank you to all the panelists for your commitment and ongoing support of this research project. From all of us, we appreciate your work and your organizations and what they're doing to combat systematic racism and inequality in sport. So I pass it back to Richard to give some introductions.
Thanks very much. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Denise O'Neill Green, who is the VP of Equity and Community Inclusion at Ryerson University, to give us a welcome.
So thank you, Richard. And thank you, everyone, for coming today. And I want to thank Anna Jacobs, Dr. Christopher Taylor, Dr. Dan Henhawk, Janelle Joseph, and Dr. Tina Chen for contributing your time to today's panel discussion. On behalf of the university, I'm pleased to be welcoming all of you to this event, which will discuss why indeed sports needs to decolonize. Sport present an incredible opportunity to instill values such as hard work, discipline, and teamwork in its participants. It can also be a key strategy to increase health promotion, physical and psychological well-being, and to counter school dropout rates, unemployment, and healthcare costs. But sports are not detached from the rest of the Canadian society. Rather, it's another institution that reflects and reinforces greater inequities and challenges, from appropriation to exclusion, to lack of access, funding, and representation, to the dominance of Eurocentric values and ideologies. Sports are not separate from everyday life. And as Henry and Tater state, sport is, quote, simply another room in the same troubled house, end quote. I'm pleased that this conversation is taking place in June, which is, of course, National Indigenous History Month. Next Monday, June 21st, we will celebrate and honor National Indigenous Peoples Day, a day to recognize the unique cultural diverse heritages of and outstanding contributions of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples to Canada. It's also a time to reflect and reaffirm our individual commitments to actively participate in truth and reconciliation every day of the year. Colonization has impacted every aspect of our lives on this land we now call Canada, including institutions of education like ours, healthcare, media, and sport. Fueled by the destructive force of white supremacy, the legacy of colonization lives on today. And this has been ever present in our mind since the discovery of the remains of the indigenous children at former residential school sites across the country these last few weeks. These truths have been told by indigenous people, survivors, and descendants of the residential school system during the hearings for the TRC, but are only now brought to the attention of the larger population. This gruesome news serves as a reminder of non-Indigenous people especially that we are all responsible for actively engaging with and participating in not only reconciliation, but also truth-telling. And so it goes that colonization is not in the past, it is squarely in our present, and we must face it in all sectors of society. And I am sure our esteemed panelists will cover, I would like to see sport evolve by actively bringing to life the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action, specifically to sports and reconciliation. Call to action number 87 speaks to the need to provide public education and increase awareness about Indigenous athletes who have and continue to shape the sector. The TRC has also noted that sport needs to be inclusive of Indigenous peoples, their diverse perspectives and experiences. This will not only require funding, but programs to increase education for coaches, trainers, officials, and athletes. And when it comes to our very important youth, we must continue to raise the costs related to, not continue to raise, we must counter the rising costs related to joining sports with strategies to increase access and inclusion. I know this is going to be a very rich discussion, and I applaud the efforts of the organizing team. And thank you so much, Richard, for pulling this together, and everyone else who's been a part of it, and each one of our panelists. I look forward to hearing what more comes out of this series, and I hope that it includes intentional action to increase inclusion in sport, not only here at Ryerson, but in the sector at large. Thank you again for including me. Appreciate your time and listening.
Thanks so much, Denise. That was amazing. I have the distinct pleasure to introduce our panel once again, Dr. Tina Chen from the University of Manitoba, Dr. Dan Henhawk from the University of Manitoba, Anna Jacobs from the MLSE Foundation, Dr. Janelle Joseph from the University of Toronto, and Dr. Christopher Taylor from the University of Waterloo. Welcome to each and every one of you. It's great to have you here today. I am going to kick it off and direct a question to Janelle, but of course, as panelists that you are, feel free to jump in and offer any insights as we go along. Just like to start, I thought I would have to frame this discussion, but Denise has done such an amazing job. I think we're good to go. But let's just start by, what do we mean by decolonize, and is it important?
Yeah, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important. Absolutely. So yes, thank you, Dr. O'Neill Green, for setting that context for us. For me, when I think about decolonization, I always want to take 2 steps back and think about what is colonization, right? We have the event of settlement of the lands on Turtle Island, but we also have the ongoing processes of genocide and attempted genocide, of removing children and women from their communities, particularly Indigenous women, and thinking of colonization as a way to appropriate cultures and disentangle people from their ancestral ways of knowing. And so we have the land side, and then we have the epistemology or the ideas side. And so these ideas about hierarchies and gender binaries and including only the fittest and strongest and most able, particularly within sporting context, but within all of the houses of our room, or the rooms of our houses. You know, if we think of colonization in that complexity, then in order to decolonize, we have to undo all of that. We have to repatriate land. We have to think about the ways that our sporting structures are destroying our environment, the way the meat consumption at stadia is really part of a system of elimination, and expecting that our lands are renewable resources that will last forever. And then, when we think about ways of knowing, ways of being, all of our sporting structures, the hierarchies, we say playground to podium, but where do we invest our monies? And, in women's sports versus men's sports, professional versus recreational. So thinking about all of these ways that we separate bodies, the ways that we force people to prove their gender or prove their ability or disability in order to participate, all of those kind of medically, scientifically sanctioned ways of categorizing bodies is part of our sporting systems, it's part of our colonial systems. And so we need to dismantle those ways of understanding even the human body, understanding how to include people if we're going to move towards decolonizing sport.
All right, we're done. Is that it? You brought up land, and I know I'm going to call on Dr. Dan Henhawk because we've had a conversation about land. What are your thoughts about the idea of decolonization and land?
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking about, and thanks for your comments, Janelle, when you were speaking about maybe the repatriation of land. I think fundamentally, well, some of the things that I'm reading and trying to understand right now is, indigenous notions of relationality, which speaks to an indigenous epistemology, which is how we know what we know. And I draw this from Sean Wilson's work, Research is Ceremony, where he talks about indigenous notions of relationality is about understanding that we are the relationship that we have. So if you understand a notion of being in relation with all these things on the land and in the cosmos, and that those things inform who you are, then you are in relationship with those beings. That colonization was the severance of that understanding of how to be in the world, of removing us from our lands and disconnecting us from that knowledge base, simply through the act of either the wars and the violence, or removing us from our homelands and then putting us into places where we could not enact the way of being that we want to be. So when I think about decolonization, some of the things I've been thinking about, and there's been a whole lot of researchers who've talked about this better than I can, but decolonization also has to be anti-colonial, and that's what I think Janelle was speaking to as well, is that we have to look at the ways that sport particularly reinforces everything that we know about colonization, from the dominant narratives of sport that reinforce, everything from ideas around our values around hard work to notions of identity, notions of what it means to be masculine, and notions of what it means to be in the world. And it is not, it's very anthropocentric, right? It's centered on human beings versus an indigenous epistemology, which is not. It focuses on our relations. So how do we get there? Because that's a challenge, because sport, if you think about it, was born out of that colonial understanding of how to be in the world. Whereas if we were to, I guess, decolonize sport, then it would have to move in the direction of not being anthropocentric and trying to move towards restoring those relationships for not only indigenous peoples, but for all of us, right? So that's some of what I'm thinking right now, but how do we get there? I don't know.
And that anthropocentrism is not a universal human, right? Absolutely, it is human over the environment and the land and animals, but it is also white humans, male humans. And so those different kinds of supremacies are interlocked. And so that decolonizing mission to me has to resist all of those different aspects of who Western sport was designed for. And we have to remember that historically those explicit rules said who could and could not literally step onto the court, onto the ice, into the arena. So if we are going to challenge that, we have to unearth the history, and turn it over to you, Dr. Taylor, to help us do that. But we need to start to understand who is sport built for, and then we've tried to add on all of these other people and pretend that that's inclusion. And we have to do more than just include people into this system that is broken. We have to dismantle it.
Yeah, I think, if it's okay, I'll jump in and pick up on Janelle's points. And I think whenever we're having this conversation, in the back of my mind, I just kind of, keep hearing the phrase from Paulo Freire over and over again. That just kind of says to us, decolonizing is the project of humanizing that has to be, done through liberation, right? And so that we really have to engage in this project of humanizing. And I come to these conversations from two different places. So I'm a scholar of Chinese history. I work in Asian studies. So I spend a lot of time thinking about colonization in Asia, which, has both led to anti-colonial movements, but they're almost all those movements are completely tied to national liberation projects as well. So the way that anti-colonialism often gets tied to being asked to be at the same table as others, to be recognized in the terms of national identity, and then the folding into those of sports and national identity and nationalism. And so the ways that those become problematic and often short circuit the anti-colonial and decolonial projects. And then the other part of my world is that I come to it through the lens of figure skating, which is a sport that I know best and do work in. And so when I think about this way that dehumanization has happened globally and within specific contexts like Canada, so much of what we see is, these kind of hierarchies, as Janelle noted, the ways of seeing whiteness and colorism, the way that Orientalism gets folded into who has value, who gets seen as having knowledge and intellectual standing. And so, and then just the aesthetics of it, through all of this as well, I'm sure we all, we think of all the work that Edward Said and others have done and think about Orientalism. And so what's aesthetically pleasing? So, I'm working a sport that's all about aesthetics and adjudication. So who gets to decide who reaches those norms? And the danger being that even when you are included, it's through these frameworks of coming to be seen as acceptable, of proximity to kind of a European whiteness. So even as we can see in a sport like figure skating, increased diversity globally by different people involved, it's really the question of what's the work to be done? It's huge, right? It's rethinking how we think aesthetics, how we think value, how we actually understand and represent. And so how do we actually humanize? And, to do that is a lot of, I guess to use the, the catchphrase, it's a lot of radical unlearning. We have to unlearn what we think makes a human being. And so, it seems so simple to say it's a project of humanizing, and through liberation, of course, that is a long process. But I think about all the kind of work that needs to be done so that we don't just get stuck at that inclusionary framework that says we have more people here. Thank you for coming to see the value of what we do, and we now see you here for the moment. It's usually always temporary too. So really unsettling the way that the contingent belonging is all that's afforded to certain people, whereas others get to kind of, always belong at the center. And, it's complicated, but, at least for figure skating, I think it's going to be a lot of discussions about what do we think is, where do we learn aesthetics, right? Where do we learn valued bodies? And that's a big conversation in a sport that's, completely troubled by whiteness and gender normativity.
Absolutely. I want to bring Anna into the conversation. We talk about decolonizing, but it is one of those troubling areas. How do we do it? Where do we focus? And as somebody who works on a more practical level, how does that manifest for you? How do you bring that into being?
Yeah, I think it also relates to bringing your identity, and there's so many intersecting identities that we have as people, and allowing folks to show up with their identities and be welcomed into a space like that. So I think I've had experience playing sport on a competitive level in college, and then I've also had an experience coaching on more of a sport for development level. So I think it's just always calling into question the ways that we talk about our bodies, how we show up. Masculinity doesn't necessarily mean that it is valued more in certain contexts and certain cultures, and kind of calling into questions those things that we've been taught were norms, because of colonialism and because of sport being the vehicle for that. When I work with kids, I try to think of how do I include everyone as the person they are and their unique gifts that they can bring. And they might not all look the same, and they might not look the way that traditionally sport and athletes are called to look like. But how can I engage with them and make it a safe space for them to show up however they show up, with whatever gifts, whatever talents, and whatever spirit that they're bringing, so that they have this important, like really, really crucial relationship with other youth, with people who are influential, like their coaches, the people that they remember, and just with sport, and then always continuing on that type of behavior and ways of relating. Like Dan said, it always comes back to relationality, and it always comes back to every living thing. So that doesn't necessarily mean humans only. It also means the land and the rocks and the things that make up the buildings that we inhabit, and breaking down the removal of that, which is what colonialism has done, and bringing those thoughts back into sport and valuing relationality in every sense, and allowing safer spaces for youth to start thinking about how they relate to the land that they're in. What's their relation to the communities that they're from? Even nutrition. What are the foods that they would normally eat if they weren't in Canada, right? Because I think that's important too, and it affects the way that we view bodies, and it affects the kind of thoughts that young athletes have about their bodies, where they don't value what would normally be something that's very beautiful and honored, but has been kind of tainted by these white supremacist ideas that are so normal. So there's a lot of things that can be done, but I think, like Dan said, like Tina said, and Janelle, like it all comes back to removing those norms, those white supremacist norms, and giving space for building those relations.
All right, I'm going to bring in Christopher. Talked about ancestry. There was a little bit of comment on history. Why is history important in this conversation?
Thank you, Dr. Rich. And everyone here, history is important for a number of reasons, but for me personally, it's an intersection of struggles that I have as a fan of sport, but as a quote unquote historian, understanding how and why organized sport, I gotta be clear on this, organized sport is the way it is in the 2020s and beyond. For example, if we're consuming organized sport in real time, say for example, if you're watching, the NBA playoffs and what the Olympics are coming up, Euros, we're just talking about that as well, is that this construction of, I love how we're talking about decolonization is tied to the humanization of people, the humanization, the relations, we need that. That being said, when we look at history, precisely why we have the big four in North America, I'm gonna say NFL, NBA, is precisely because of dehumanization of Black bodies during the transatlantic slave trade, the human trafficking of Black bodies, and the period of enslavement. And the dehumanization of the Black man in particular to be a quote unquote beast of burden. As Dr. Winalda Walcott would say, in this space of what we now call North America, we were either waste or product. And the product that Black men in particular continue to be in what we now call North America was to be a product that was just defined by their physicality. So I sit in these spaces to say, and I'm really glad Dr. Joseph and we're all talking about really looking at the radical roots of what colonization is. And if we really problematize that, then it's not just, okay, we're gonna get more Black owners or get more Black GMs and so on and so forth. We need to understand precisely why we have sport the way it is because we still see, and again, I'm framing Blackness, I'm locating myself here, we still see Black people as objects to be consumed. And I don't care how you feel about a certain person who's now hurt that plays for Brooklyn, Kyrie Irving. He was not wrong about what he said about being in the human zoo. And that has a lot of historical significance. I mean, going back to Sarah Bartman, like the Black body has always been seen as a product to be jeered at, to be laughed at, to be consumed. So it's a troubling, I don't want to say troubling, but I'm in an intriguing space because I love sport. I love organized sport. You know, Dr. Joseph, you work on cricket, like that's the thing for me. And if we problematize cricket, it's this interesting relationship with colonized peoples and cricket and what colonialism defined us in that space. But we need to understand the history, as we've all mentioned, in order to decolonize the intersections and how everything is symbiotic and woven together to unpack.
There's a number of practices within sports that I think some folks have believe might be things of the past, you know, particularly the overt racism that a lot of Black athletes experience. And certainly representation is not going to solve our problems, but representation is also a problem. So I'm not opposed to hiring more Black coaches and more GMs, etc. But absolutely, we need to think not just about numbers, but also about power. But let's think about, you know, the actual practices within organized sports, the racial abuse that so many different athletes are experiencing for different reasons, the way that hooliganism continues both in person in stadium and online attacks. Shireen Ahmed wrote a great article that came out in the Walrus yesterday. And, you know, as a racialized female sports journalist, she's really representing around anti-colonialism and decolonizing sport. And some of the things that she had to say about how fans in some cases perpetuate racist violence and colonial violence, but also how some fans are using their platforms to resist, to get teams to change their Indigenous names for mascots, to get owners to create gender parity so that we can see that, you know, female athletes and male athletes are getting paid the same thing. These kinds of ways that fans can be part of the conversation, I think is really important to acknowledge. So yeah, absolutely. Shout out to sports journalists who are doing the work to move this decolonizing conversation into the public sphere.
That's amazing. I should note for anyone who is tuned in, please, if you have questions for the panelists, there is a Q&A box. Feel free to offer your questions. Before we move on to a little other segment, there was one question from the audience, and I'm going to direct it to Dan and Anna, talking about the idea about in relation and what does that teach us, or how is it colonialization, and how colonization broke that. If you could just expand on what you mean by in relation.
Sorry, what's the question again?
The direct question is, please elaborate on the comment about being in relation to the world around us and how colonization broke that.
Well, it goes back again to that history of how Indigenous peoples lived in the world, their own being, right? So how they understood the world and how they saw the world was through their understanding of relationship to everything in the land and the cosmos. Now, that requires you to understand those things as having either a consciousness or a spirit or an energy, or at least knowledge, right? So those things that are not human provide us knowledge. And so being in relationship, or being made up of relationships, really, that's what it is about. Made up of those relationships means that we're listening to those things in the world, which means a different, I guess, I don't want to say different, an Indigenous human connection to the world that was then severed through colonization, through the removals of us from our lands, or from, again, the capitalist economy that developed around looking at the world as being resources versus being relations. So being in relationship or being made up of those relations is very much about how we relate as human beings to the world, which again is a huge divide for sport to make, because sport is based upon, in my perspective, on a view of the world that is very disconnected from those relations. So unless sport can shift itself to focus on how to bring that back into sports, then it's going to be a bit of a long road, in my opinion. I don't know. Any thoughts on that, Anna, or anyone else?
Yeah, the way that I have been taught about relationality is that everything is our kin. So we are related to everything in creation. And that is down to like the very molecules that make up everything. And I think because of capitalism, because of white supremacy, we're so far removed from that type of thinking. Not all of us, but I think just in Canada, I think it's not common for people in institutions to think that way. And so I think that's kind of where a good starting point is kind of reminding ourselves that we are a part of this world that we live in, creation being everything that's around us. And like Dan said, everything is living, everything has a spirit or stories or knowledge that will continue on whether we're here as humans or not. So getting back to that type of thinking allows us to break down those really toxic ideas of kind of how we interact with each other as being exchanges. And I know that we as Indigenous folks have been removed from those ways of living, moved onto pieces of land that we may not have been in traditionally. We might not have farmed. We might not have understood those areas. And it started there with folks being disconnected, children being taken. It still happens today in the child welfare system. And it's something that it broke down those ways of living. And so I think to get back to that is beneficial to everyone because we're all related and because we all have our own spirit and we all have our own gifts and things that we bring to the table. I think it's beneficial for everyone to examine the ways we're living right now and how we can kind of connect more to all of creation. It's something that is free. You can do it for free. So I think I've been very fortunate in my work to have the space to work like that and be surrounded by folks who are supportive of me bring myself and my entire self into my work and into my life. So I think it's something that everyone can do regardless of the structures that you're working in. On a personal level, you can start doing that now and start working on the ways you relate to everything in creation, including each other.
Amazing. That's thank you so much. Want to shift gears a little bit and talk about our wonderful Canadian sports system, NSO, PSO, and sort of trying to unpack how those institutions or institutions in general uphold those colonial ideas. How are those things reinforced? And anybody can jump in.
I can jump in and just start off and say, I feel like my last, year of my life has, both been this exciting moment of working really closely with Skate Canada. I'm thinking about the sport of skating. In many ways, though, driven by grassroots groups. So in figure skating, we've seen the Figure Skating Diversity and Inclusion Alliance come forward and really push forward what needs to happen. And, I think it's a difficult conversation because, we can say and ask NSOs to acknowledge, and, I see some in the chat as well, university athletics, that they are part of the problem, that they have benefited from colonization, that are very structures, and at the heart of them are these kind of colonial knowledge ways, hierarchies. And, I think at least some of us, are getting a little bit of traction there. We're getting that heard, and people learn to repeat that. The question, though, is what comes next, right? That kind of radical undoing. So, for me, I think education is the first part, but, way too often, and so many people have already talked about capitalism. We're in a world where sport is tied into capitalism, and the desire is for quick answers and for a checklist of things to get done. Everyone's like, what do you need us to do? And I'm like, I need, I think we're all agree here. We need everyone to think fundamentally differently. We need them to also understand that there's a kind of the meritocracy itself that we like to think of sport. And we just start talking about how do we make it more open, more people to be able to, flourish in sport, all of this, at the very basis of a meritocracy has been exactly what people have talked about, Chris, especially, basis of dehumanization. Where do people get value? So meritocracy isn't that. It's not even socioeconomic. It's all of these ways of rethinking. And so how do you make time and space for that when the cycles continue? Everyone on here is interested in sport. We love sport, right? So the cycles of qualifying, Olympic qualifiers, getting to Olympics, they're so tied into it. So where do you make the time? And I think that's the really difficult part of it, is how do you make time? And then also, in my mind, having now worked with an NSO, how do we hold even Sport Canada accountable for this? So, to what extent is funding flowing related on, are you putting the time in to do the work, not to go through a checklist, but are we giving you the time? Are we allowing you to transform your sport? And then are we supporting you when you go out to your international organizations? Are we working in those? Because these are global contexts. We can make changes even on a domestic sphere, but we can't make those same ones. So, in skating, they finally, and this may come as a surprise to people, but there are 2 steps in skating that were named a Mohawk and a Choctaw. And until this year, they remain those. And finally, in a moment, domestically in Canada, they were renamed to simply do the shape on the ice. There are a C step and an S step. And that it took this long to really think that way. Obviously, it's a first step, but also acknowledging that as soon as we leave the country, those steps still have to go by their previous names, right? So where does the pressure, where does the momentum come? So I think it's just really Sport Canada and funding has to roll out relative to allowing the space and the time and that work to be done, rather than just assuming that, you can kind of move people quickly, because capitalism is really in many ways premised upon, profit. Colonialism was put in place to make profit, and it still requires it to make profit. And so, what we're asking people to do says different values. And how do we get there? It's way complicated, but I think that the NSOs and Sport Canada have a huge role to play, and professional organizations as well. And they have to think about where their profits came from and how they want to redirect.
Oh, there's so much I want to build on there, Tina. Thank you so much for those comments. I'm working with the E-Alliance, the Gender Equity and Research Hub in Canada. And so they are partially funded by Sport Canada. And, this money is going into research, particularly focused on women and girls, but thinking more broadly about how we can change our systems through deep intersectional work, like understanding that all of the women and girls we want to support also have a gender. Some might identify as Indigenous, some might identify as disabled or living in a disabling society, and some might be all at once. And so thinking about how do we actually shift the way that we are doing sport to really think about inclusion as not just including different kinds of people, but really breaking down the systems that have perpetuated the oppression on an ongoing basis. I know one of my colleagues has done work with with Skate Canada, particularly around the transgender inclusion policy. And it's only in the last couple of years that people can show up and identify how they want and perform with the team that they want. And, it's those kinds of movements. And I don't mean to say that only, for example, trans inclusion or LGBTQ inclusion is decolonization, because as you have mentioned, if we're including them in a white system and then the performances and aesthetics are based on this colonial history, then we don't need to, then we will be perpetuating the same problem. But they are interrelated. So the kind of work that we need to do, I think it's about research. It's also about education. We throw around this word unlearning and unsettling, but how do we actually do do that. And part of that is through, as Dan has so eloquently explained, through our relationality, through understanding other people. And, you know, we all need to look in the mirror and look at our communities. If you're in a community of people, scholars, athletes, leaders who look like you and think like you, then you have to do more to understand different ways of knowing and being. And so that unlearning is really, really important. And one of the sport organizations that I'm working with is Ontario University Athletics, and they are an institution that has taken a look in the mirror and has said, you know, we have some issues here, particularly around racism, and we want to know what are our demographics and what are the experiences of racism that athletes, coaches and administrators are having, and what can we do to change? Where are the best practices? So, you know, research into these kinds of questions and then sharing that knowledge and educating people across all elements of the sports sector, the fans, as have already been mentioned, the athletes, the coaches, the administrators, the athletic therapists. You know, sport is such a system. And so it's not just going to be a one-pronged approach. You're not going to have a checklist that just has a couple of items on it and then you'll be done. Because coloniality is ongoing, we are going to have an ongoing decolonizing process. But I think that unlearning, we need to think about all of the different ways that we can do that. Are you watching podcasts? Are you making new friends? Are you reading some books? Are you watching movies? What are the sources of information that you're getting, and are they challenging your thinking about right and wrong, excellence and success? Like, how are you getting your information? We need to really start challenging ourselves to do more.
And just quickly building off of the education piece, we need to understand, again, I'm always framing organized sport. I'm always very careful to say organized sport, is unlearning where organized sport came from. If you look at historically, organized sport in the West, quote unquote, was this Victorian 19th century, 1800s ideal to confine, to define and quote unquote civilize, again, quote unquote, people. And so when we're fast forwarding in the 2020s and beyond, we need to question, why are we in sport? What is the purpose of sport? What is the purpose? I was listening to a conversation. So Dr. Joseph, as you mentioned about podcasts, I was listening to a podcast the other day and someone was asking, what's the purpose of professional sport? Is it to win? Or when you have the agency, quote unquote, of professional athletes now, is to say, well, you know what? It's about me, it's about my body, it's about my life. But isn't it to win? So I think we need to problematize like the whole purpose of sport, and not on an intellectual academic space, as I use big academic terms like problematize. We need to get into spaces and ask and teach, you know, kids, young people, this is what sport's about. And I really like, you know, Anna and Dan, how we're just engaged, not just sport, but what is it to be in relation? Is that what sport's supposed to be, in relation to everything around us?
Yeah, if I can just add on to that. Thanks for your comments, Chris. What I was thinking about when you're talking was, you know, if we were to, again, take the idea of radical transformation, we have to, I think, entertain the idea that in the future, there might not be sport as we know it today. And that's a very, very hard thing, I think, for people to even imagine, but we have to try and imagine it. But we don't really know, right, until we actually start putting into practice the ideas of humanization and what that means. And until we start putting into practice things like relationality, we don't know what that means for sport until we actually start to do it. Because sport was born out of that historical process of dehumanization and severing that notion of relationship and building off of resources, looking at the world as a resource versus being a place where we can actually extend our relationships. So, you know, I think that's one of the hardest things to think about for me anyway, because I do love sport. Don't get me wrong, like it's one of those things where it is such a beautiful human thing to do, to engage in sport. But the things that we've created out of it, the things, I guess the social meanings that we've created around it have been inherently dehumanizing for a lot of different people and for ourselves. So I think it's going to take a real radical imagination to start to think differently about how we engage in sport. And the one comment was, how do we how do we promote, our children's dreams of being a professional athlete without crushing those, dreams? But I think that there might not necessarily be something wrong with being a professional athlete, but it's what the meanings that we attach to it and how we go about engaging in being a professional athlete or a professional coach or what have you. So I'll leave it at that and pass it on to someone else.
Thanks, Dan. I'll echo that. Absolutely. We pay a lot of attention to high performance sport and to professional sport, but let's face it, the vast majority, millions, dare I say, over 30 million Canadians are not doing that, right? They are recreational community athletes who focus on the embodied, lived, visceral experience of moving in whatever way, shape, or form they do in whatever communities they can access. So if we really want to think about decolonizing sport, we need to think about that entire range. And how do we allow people to see themselves in leadership positions and in participation in a variety of forms? I'm all for that.
All right, taking it up a level now. We're going global. We have the Olympics coming up, and we have those institutions, on the international level. What does that mean for the space of decolonization? Nobody wants to touch that one.
I'm going to jump in. I'm a specialist in Asia, and I feel like it is like rooted in my world right now. But I was looking at Chris going, Chris, I want to hear what you have to say here as well. I think this is one of the really interesting points is that and I referred to it right at the very beginning, the way that sport has been tied into anti-colonial and national liberation movements, and particularly in colonized areas. So when we look at places like Asia, we can see that, and people like Anne-Marie Brodehoux have done like fantastic work on the Olympics of spectacle, what it's meant in Asia, what it meant for Beijing to have the, Olympics and the whole narrative of the Summer Olympics as they're coming of age onto the international world. It was all just like, it was way too predictable in what it was, but that was the story, right? And then, as we all know, the kinds of human rights abuses and things that were happening even to build those facilities for the Summer Olympics, right? This goes into it. This is part of how you put spectacle on. And I know there's so much speculation right now about, as Tokyo looks forward to theirs, and it's not just about the investment and the money, but it's the national prestige. There is no way they can step back from the games knowing that Beijing has the next games. So it is completely tied also into regional nationalistic competition that's rooted in Japanese responses of Western colonialism, the Pan-Asian militarism that they then responded with, and the way that that kind of colonization of a second moment of colonization happened across Asia. So when we start talking about decolonizing, we're like, wow, so incredibly complicated. Where do we go from here? And what power do we have through the IOC, right? When, I think most would agree that, as people have been putting in the chats, capitalism is running it, right? So it's not about sport, but then also what it means to people to have those stages. And I think, as we look now about, we've been critiquing this kind of representation, but the way that it gives voices to those who then can provide and try and push us. And frustrating as it is, because we know it's the same critique, whether it's 68 Olympics, it's the same critique every time about extractive capitalism and people's bodies, right? But we need to keep having those platforms. So I think the Olympics, when it's where it's located, how it's located, but also then what it means for people to participate. So how do we actually provide those adequate platforms so that each time that people are there to amplify the voices and carry the voices forward, even as we recognize how problematic the institution is, right? And I guess that's where I just feel like I'm powerless to stop it, at this moment, but can we make sure that we're amplifying and creating the ground so that the voices as they come forward are critical, that they can start pushing the seeds of decolonization and the seeds of learning differently and hearing differently, and not putting so much of an impetus on those individual athletes who are also training, right? They're learning and training, but when they speak out, there's others of us who have to do that work all alongside to make sure those voices get the traction and are just brought forward so that they're not just lone voices when the Olympics are on TV or streaming, I guess now. There I totally aged myself on TV. So I'll leave it there.
And I'll jump in quickly there. Dr. Chen, I think you nailed it there. It's such a complex space because when we look at decolonization or anti-colonialism on a global scale, it is similar to how we speak of it in what is now known as North America, Turtle Island. It's similar, however, there's a very different relationship with people on that stage. And again, I'm centering my positionality as a cishet, able-bodied Black male, second-generation Canadian, that if we're looking at, that transformation of Black bodies on an international scale, exceeding and succeeding and excelling in white sport, that is a form of anti-colonialism. So for me to come out and say, oh, by the way, Usain Bolt shouldn't have been who he was, and he's not, and that's not the whole purpose of international sport, but at the same time, that's an anti-colonial frame, an anti-imperial American framework. So as Dan was saying, I have a complex relationship with the sport in terms of what I think it could be, but also the benefits I see within it. I mean, I always center, particularly in a Canadian context, how we looked at Ben Johnson. For us of a certain age in this space here, how we looked at Ben Johnson, you have a displaced person from the African continent, planted in Jamaica, a colonial state, comes to Canada, is the best. And from that process in 1988 in Seoul, Korea, of all places, how this destroyed the Black identity that he tried to create as a Black Canadian, as a Canadian. I wish there was a clean answer, Dr. Rich. I wish there was. There isn't. I'll be watching the Olympics, streaming it and watching it on TV, for the record.
Can I just add on to that? Thanks for your comments, Chris. When you mentioned identity, it all brings me back to Sandy Grandi's work around creating a red pedagogy, or a space of engagement for discussing anti-colonialism and decolonization. But she talks about identity, this focus on identity, particularly for Indigenous peoples, is this idea that Indigenous peoples haven't been able to fit into modern society. But focusing on identity refuses to look at that materialist encounter or makeup of the world that we live in. So how we actually be in the world with the things that we have around us. And so for me, and again, that comes back to looking at the systems and the structures and the material world that we live in, and then changing that to then start dealing with how do we engage our identities in the world. So I just wanted to put that out there. And then the other thing I would just want to throw out was, we've talked about decolonization, and I think we have to wrap our heads around what that means on all levels. Certainly, I'm coming at it from Eve Tuck's perspective of saying decolonization is about the repatriation of Indigenous lands and life and relationship, versus decolonization being how they put it as a metaphor of doing all these things, which I think is important. It's important to engage in the processes, but we have to look at what that original colonialist encounter was about, which was taking Indigenous lands, looking at it as a resource, and then turning it into a global system of servitude and slavery and all those types of things. So I'll just throw that out there for now.
I just want to bring Anna into this, and you're dealing with youth a lot. What have you seen a shift in the way that you're dealing with, young people who have aspirations of going to the Olympics and things like that? And what are those conversations like for you?
I think my experience has been more realistic in the sense that the youth that I've worked with, they kind of understand their level of play. So I work mostly with the really young ones. So they're the ones that are just getting introduced to sport and are just trying to be active and just learning the fundamentals. So I can't really speak to kind of like a competitive stream, but I think it's just important to, and Christopher is the historian of the group, like it's important to know like the history of things that you're a part of and the history of the world that you live in and the things that matter to you. So I think understanding the history of the Olympics and those competitive streams and stuff like that is very important, because you can understand, if you do make it to that point, you can understand kind of the context that you will be put in. And I think in the people who are really good at speaking out when they reach those areas are people who understand their place in it and can see the importance of how they've made it there, but also are critical of that system itself. So I think, you know, knowing who you are, your context in this world, how it relates to sport, is super important. And I think that can start really young too. It can be really simple conversations, and you can say things in a way that just invites critical thinking, even for young ones. So I think when I deal with youth who have mentors or idols that are like very successful, never discourage that ever, but also ask them like, why do you love that person? And encourage those critical thinking kind of thought starters real early, so that they're always thinking of the why, and they can understand the context of where they are in sport better. And so they're not crushed by the system if they are successful in it and if they go far into it, because it can be very discouraging when you have this view of what success in sport is, and then you are met with the systems that are in power.
That's great. I'm looking at our time. I think we have time for one question. I appreciate everybody who's been adding to the chat. After the fact, we might be able to answer some of these questions. Dan brought up the idea of future and what it looks like. For me, I'm a futurist, but I also rely on my man, Frantz Fanon, and he was talking about decolonization as a process to reorder the world towards total disorder. And I guess the question for the group is, are we ready for this? Are we really ready to decolonize our society? And what do you think the future holds?
I think it has to be a radical act, but it doesn't have to be all at once. So are we ready for the whole thing tomorrow? No, I'll be really clear, it's not happening. But in recognizing all of the things that we have talked about, you know, the unlearning and desegregating and, you know, moving towards questioning, critical thinking, and, you know, thinking about aesthetics, all of these questions, bringing them up, having conversations. I'm seeing some things in the chat about people who are creating policy, creating ethical frameworks. So all of those things, I think, little by little, will move us in that direction. So I think we're ready to take some steps. We're ready to check some boxes, and we need to make sure that that conversation continues.
I'll just jump in quick, and I agree. It's, you know, tomorrow, are we ready for Fanon? I mean, even though Fanon was ready, what, nearly 70 years ago, are we ready? Possibly. But at the same time, I think, you know, I really look in terms of our life now in this space is that we are just a blip in human history. We are just a blip in world history. And I have conversations with folks all the time about, you know, Black folk, again, citing myself in this space, the Black folk, you know, being dehumanized. But I'm like, in human history, this is just a fraction of our time. I don't know what the world's going to be like in 400 years. I have no idea, right? And so maybe we are putting those steps in place already to have this radical change in our spaces, possibly.
And I would say, I think we're moving towards being ready. You know, it's one of those things in that kind of radical transformation that one of the great problems with, you know, Fanon actually, and trying to think how we think about decolonization and the violence that Fanon identified with holding up colonization is that people refuse to see the violence. They refuse to see it in their life. And we are at a moment now where that violence cannot be not seen, right? I mean, whether it's, you know, finally, people seeing and hearing about children in graves at residential schools, whether it's Black Lives Matter, all of this, the violence is so much more evident for a variety of reasons. And so in some ways now, all of us being forced and having to open our eyes to see the violence opens up that space to where Fernanda says there's a violence. And so that also decolonization can't be about, this, let's all just get along, don't disrupt my sport, it's all nice, because we actually all didn't always get along. And there is a premise of violence. And so once we actually have to see it, I think there's an opening. And so I think that there's kind of a moment where we can move now before people stop seeing violence, because unfortunately, we all have really short attention spans. So we need to keep seeing it and we need to keep acknowledging it so that we can make the change sooner rather than later.
I think that idea, Tina, is very well said, the idea of violence. I guess the question is, how do we see sport as continuing that violence on ways that aren't necessarily Indigenous children in a graveyard in a residential school, but how is it continuing that violence? That notion of violence, though, is still very anthropocentric, though, isn't it? I think, right? And I think, are we ready for change? No, not tomorrow, but we're going to have to be. And I think the reason why we're going to have to be ready is because I think the environment is going to dictate that change. And it's already here and it's already coming. So dealing with the climate crisis is, I think, going to be part of this process of dealing with the violence of all these institutions and structures that we've created. And hopefully that creates the impetus for us to actually change in a relatively short period of time. But we can't predict that future, right? So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I don't know that it matters so much to me if we're ready. I just think it's a responsibility. And I don't think you can wait to be ready to do something that needs to be done and that's harmful. So yeah, I think like the call on all of us is to keep pushing and keep doing, regardless of whoever's ready or not, because we don't have anything to lose in trying to do it beyond like ego. And I know that's like very simplifying everything, but I think everyone's here because they care about sport and they care about young people and athletes, and they have their own relationships with sport. And I think we're here because we all want to see a sport space that is healthy and breaks down the really toxic, harmful things that we kind of have to just deal with, and we have to just start doing the things, start having the conversations. And I think young people know that so much. Young people are far along that journey than I think even I was, and I am not, I'm 29 years old. So we know the stories from old folks. We know the stories from before, like generations and generations before. We know the history of everything. So we have no choice but to just start the work, whether people are ready or not, whether we're ready or not.
Thanks so much, Anna. That's a perfect, wrap up. Me being one of those old people, it's really great to hear that perspective. I want to thank our panelists, Dan Henhawk, Tina Chen, Christopher Taylor, Janelle Joseph, and Anna Jacobs for being part of this. I want to thank my co-host. It's been happy working behind the scenes, Savannah Webb, for being part of this as well. Good to see you back. I just want to thank you all again, and thank you everyone who's tuned in today. As I said, this is all being recorded, so as we will be posting this when we can, and let everybody know where you can direct some other people to this wonderful conversation. So thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.